I don't think a hallucination, whether it's psychedelic or psychiatric or dream machine, is of a different category than normal experience, all the time.
This video is about how we basically daydream all of reality and how neuroscience can make sense of it.
There was an artist, Brian Gysin, who had been sitting on a bus in southern France and was dozing off and his eyes were closing and the sun was setting and the bus went along a straight road and the sun set behind some trees, which gave a flickering light effect. And he had these experiences.
How is it that white stroboscopic light can trigger vivid, colorful images in our brains? Neuroscientist Anil Seth and his team at the University of Sussex designed an experimental setup to test this. It's called the Dream Machine, and I was about to get launched. I'm ready.
It's just white light that's flashing. And yet most people will experience vivid colors, lots of geometric patterns, lots of things changing over time. In the Dream Machine, you are the artist. You're not looking at something. Something is happening within your own mind and brain, and you experience it that way. You don't experience yourself as looking at something.
Wow. A lot of colors.
Yeah.
A lot of colors. Yeah, very trippy. Very trippy. Yeah. These are drawings by the hundreds of people who have participated in the Dream Machine research so far.
Perception, instead of being this sort of passive registration of objective reality, is an active interpretation. It comes from the inside out as much as the outside in. What we experience is not a readout of the sensory data.
In this conversation, we will touch upon the world-leading neuroscience Anil Seth and his team are working on, and on its metaphysical implications. I must say I did have a hard time to still see you as a materialist, Anil, just reading your book and all your thoughts. So I was super curious where you are right now and if you still like that label. A very warm welcome to the Essentia Foundation's YouTube channel. I have the honor of sitting down with Professor Anil Seth. A very warm welcome.
Thank you, Hans. It's a pleasure. Thanks for coming to Sussex.
Yeah, and thanks for inviting me in such a beautiful location. I think it's our most stunning.
It's pretty good.
It's awesome. What is it actually? It's a chapel, I guess.
It's a chapel. It's the meeting house. And many things go on here. At the moment, it sort of looks very Catholic inside, but I think it's more broad than that. I've done Tai Chi classes in here, but it's just a beautiful space and we're lucky to have it in the center of campus at Sussex University.
Yeah, what a great place to discuss consciousness with you. Just first, a very brief introduction, but you're a professor of cognitive and computational neuroscience here at the University of Sussex and director of the Sussex Center of Consciousness Science, and of course well known as being a great science explainer. And you've written a wonderful book that we will touch upon also in this conversation titled Being You, A New Science of Consciousness. So I'd love to hear about what you consider that new science to be. And to start with, I read that at the university you and your team are in the midst of perhaps the biggest study you could say on perception and consciousness done so far, with tens of thousands of participants on what you call perceptual diversity. The fact that though there is a consensus reality, of course, we all see, in a sense, a completely different world. And I was just super curious where that research is, and if you could touch upon that. And to relate it back to the chapel in this room, are we seeing the same room here, right? That's sort of the perceptual diversity.
That's the question. That's the question. I don't think we're having a completely different experience. So I would just nuance a bit what you said there, that there is a sort of consensus reality. If you stand in the middle of a road and a bus is coming, it's going to hurt when it hits you, whatever you think might be going on. But our experience of the same shared objective reality is unlikely to be exactly the same. And what we wanted to do in this project called the Perception Census is try to get both a broader and a deeper view on what we've been calling perceptual diversity. So this is why it's a big study. It's certainly not the biggest study of perception, but I think it's the biggest study of this kind. And what we've done is we've collected data from about 40,000 people, so that's quite a large sample in this field. And those people haven't done just one thing, not just a visual illusion task or something, but up to 55 different questionnaires and perceptual tasks and visual illusions and vision and hearing, other things too. Just surfacing the diversity that's out there is really important in all sorts of ways. Because I think this gets us to questions about the nature of perception. We're in this meeting house now. It just seems that it's there in a mind-independent manner. I mean, that's the naive view of perception. I think whatever your metaphysics or your theory of conscious might be, you wake up in the morning and you open your eyes and a world appears. And here it just seems as though we're in this beautiful room and it's just there. And because it seems in our experience to be mind-independent, then it's hard to appreciate that other people might be in the same room, you and I here, we might experience the colors slightly differently. There are some examples, that famous picture of the dress that half the world saw as blue and black, half of white and gold.
We can put the link again. We touched upon it earlier. That was a moment that worldwide you recognized, wait a minute, that supposedly observer-independent reality can be perceived quite differently, right?
Right, but I think it was also a missed opportunity in a sense, because people took it as a sort of weird outlier. This quirk, and then you go back to your normal existence where things just are as they are. The dress was powerful because the experiences were so different, people used different words, and they could start to argue, do you see it as white and gold? How can you see that? And it's crazy.
Yeah.
But if I see, I don't know, the green of a window panel across there as a slightly different green, we might never know, because we'll use the same word.
And that's what this study is about then.
So we're trying to look at these under the surface, these differences in perception that might not be noticeable unless you really look very carefully.
What's truly interesting to me is the cases where we all seem to have a diversity going on. I'm now getting to sort of your dream machine research, where people with closed eyes in this setup, and you can tell more about that, there are stroboscopic lights and you have your eyes closed, and people are then asked afterwards to sort of report on what they've experienced. And these experiences, there's a lot of diversity there, right? But it's super rich. Whereas the sensory input is, it's just light flashing at a sort of a frequency. That fascinates me. How does that relate? Because that seems that we all have this ability, and it also points to how the same reality, if you would look at in the room, sort of leads to this super diverse phenomenological reality, right?
Right. If you sit in front of a brightly flashing stroboscopic light at the right frequency, your eyes closed, usually, you will have interesting visual experiences that are definitely very different from what the sensory stimulation might naively suggest. It's just white light that's flashing, and yet most people will experience vivid colors, lots of geometric patterns, lots of things changing over time, sometimes other more complicated forms as well. That's already a kind of powerful tool for consciousness research, if you like. It's a controlled way of generating hallucinatory experiences without pharmacological interventions. So our kind of long game here is to try and sort of have people report on their experiences over time and also track what's happening in the brain. But there's a lot of groundwork to be done that we're still doing.
Do you have any understanding how white lights can lead to these rich experiences?
And there's a long history of it, actually. So it's one of those things, and we've been playing around with this method since 2012, so well over a decade now. And when we first came across it, this is with my colleague David Schwartzman, who in the Sussex group is now leading this research. We looked into the history, and there's a long history. So right back at the beginnings of neuroscience, really, William Gray Walter, who was one of these very eccentric British polymath scientists, he developed a lot of the early EEG systems and developed also early robotics. He was responsible for these tortoises that would kind of recharge themselves in early cybernetics. he has an amazing book in 1953, and one chapter of this book is called Revelation by Flicker, and it's all about stroboscopic-induced hallucinations. This is 1953. Around the same time, there was an artist, Brian Gysin, who had been sitting on a bus in southern France and was dozing off, and his eyes were closing, and the sun was setting, and the bus went along a straight road, and the sun set behind some trees, which gave a flickering light effect. And he had these experiences, and he wanted to sort of recreate them systematically. But as an art experience, the idea that Brian Gysin had was that he coined the term the dream machine, and he would say that in the dream machine, you are the artist. You're not looking at something. You know, something is happening within your own mind and brain, and you experience it that way. You don't experience yourself as looking at something. You experience things as manifesting more or less internally, which is rather fascinating. When you flash stroboscopic light at the right kind of frequencies, and the sort of frequencies that work best are typically in the alpha rhythm. So this is around 10 cycles per second, 10 hertz. This is the resting oscillation, roughly, of the visual part of the brain. When you close your eyes, if I close my eyes now, if I had sensors on the back of my head, you would immediately see the alpha rhythm increase. So there would be a more prominent 10 hertz oscillation.
Yeah.
And so what's happening, at least the first thing that's happening, is that this flashing light is entraining and driving this intrinsic alpha rhythm, call it entrainment, when an external drive kind of activates and resonates with some internal brain oscillation. That's one thing. That's one level of what's happening, and then of course that can that can lead to activity kind of sweeping through other parts of the brain and so on.
Yeah.
Conceptually, what I think is going on is that the brain is always trying to make sense of sensory data.
Yeah.
Normally, the data has some kind of structure, as it does now. When your eyes are closed and it's just a field of white light, there's no real structure apart from the on-off frequency, but that's very fast. Our brains don't really do well resolving that kind of thing. The only thing giving structure to the input is the brain itself. So I think it's a situation in which, rather than using the architecture of our visual cortex to see the world, like we see through the sort of like parts of our visual cortex may be specific to detecting edges or lines or textures. Normally, we use those parts of our brains to see through. But I think what's happening in the dream machine is that we see those things themselves, because they're the only things giving structure to the input, and that's the only thing the brain can latch onto to make sense of.
There's this beautiful quote. I don't know where I read it in one of your presentations, but it's from the Impressionist painter Gauguin, who says, "We close our eyes in order to see." And it relates to all of this, but I just find it beautiful. And I want to use it sort of as a bridge to your controlled hallucination. I think it's a nice way to understand it, right? You've written about that. In Impressionist paintings, we get to see sort of just with a couple of strokes a French scenery, and somehow we find it beautiful. And because you say, right, we feel it's as if we project onto the canvas an image. Could you tell how you see all of this and how it relates to what you call a controlled hallucination?
Yeah, I'm still just a sucker for Impressionist art. I just love it, and I haven't really progressed much beyond it. It's one of my favorite kind of moments in art history. And I think maybe it is because it really does have this direct relevance and resonance with how I've come to think about perception. You look at a Monet or a Manet or Pissarro, and indeed, it's just sort of palette scrapings. As you get closer, you can see that the texture's really rough, it's not detailed. Yet when you step away, the visual impression you get has a richness and a kind of liveliness that is very different from looking at a detailed photograph of the same scene.
Yeah.
So what's the difference? I think the difference is captured best by, there was one of the classic 20th century art historians was Ernst Gombrich, and apparently he's very unfashionable in art history circles now. He had this concept of the beholder's share around the 1960s. And his idea was the aesthetic impact of an artwork is at least partly and probably largely determined by the beholder's share, what the beholder, the observer, is contributing to the act of perceiving the artwork. If we look at a photograph, we're not contributing that much, unless the photograph is eliciting different kind of concepts and other things. With Impressionist art, we're contributing a lot. There's the painter has, in a sense, reverse engineered the visual system, not to paint the output of perceptual inference, but to paint the raw data, to paint the light. And so when you look at that painting, your brain is actively engaged in making sense of it in a way that it isn't in other situations.
And could this, but may I lend your sort of neuroscientific wisdom and knowledge here? On psychedelics, I have had an imagery that I could only afterwards describe. I actually call it a Van Gogh painting. I saw a Van Gogh sky of the heavens, and the famous Van Gogh with the stars. Does this, and if it does not, please say so, then we continue, but does it in some way relate to what you just said?
I think it might. So I think, so this does all connect up. So when you take psychedelics, one thing that seems to be going on is you're sort of messing around with the neuroscientific version of the beholder's share. You're changing how your brain is interpreting the sensory information. I've had similar experiences. You look at clouds, on a psychedelic experience, and suddenly, they seem to come to life and they change and they morph into shapes and so on, and animals, and almost sometimes under one's voluntary control. So I think in this case, this aspect of, let's say, a psychedelic experience is, at least in broad brushes, it's understandable as manipulating how the brain is interpreting the sensory data that it gets. And this brings us to this central concept of controlled hallucination. Because I don't think a hallucination, whether it's psychedelic or psychiatric or dream machine, is of a different category than normal experience, all the time.
This is very interesting. And this is what a lot of people describe, right? It feels so real that when you get back, to me, it had the world now I see has the same reality status, but I do have to agree, it's more controlled in a sense. Is that a way to put it? It feels more controlled because it does not have such diversity, and it's more stable. And I know you have more or less the same, so it feels much more controlled, but a hallucination nevertheless.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. I think you can the world sort of snaps back, right? But one thing that I think can be taken from those kinds of experiences is the realization that actually your brain is always involved in constructing the experience. It's not something weird that suddenly happens under a pharmacological influence. It just happens differently under that influence in a way that may be less constrained by sensory data. So the basic idea is, it's a very old idea, and it goes back to Kant again, and Hermann von Helmholtz in the late 19th century was the first person to talk about perception as, he called it unconscious inference. So his idea was, from the brain's perspective, all it gets is noisy and ambiguous sensory information, not labeled, ambiguous, has to make sense of it. So the only way it can make sense of it is through broadly what we might call Bayesian inference. It has to combine this ambiguous sensory data with some prior expectation or belief or prediction about what's going on, and then use the sensory information to update that prediction. Perception, instead of being this sort of passive registration of objective reality, is an active interpretation. It comes from the inside out as much as the outside in. You fast forward to sort of these days, and people talk about predictive processing, predictive coding, active inference. This just has really updated the Helmholtz story to provide a more sophisticated, nuanced idea of the mechanisms involved. And now we have the idea that the brain, in some way or other, encodes a generative model. It's able to generate predictions about the causes of sensory signals. Modern machine learning things do this too. And the hypothesis of predictive processing is that the brain is continually using this internal generative model to create predictions about what's happening, which flow in this top-down or inside-out direction. And the sensory signals that come into the brain serve as prediction errors that report the difference between what the brain gets and what it expects at all levels of sort of processing within the brain. And if the brain follows a fairly simple rule of just minimizing these prediction errors, either by updating the predictions or by changing the data, by maybe moving your eyes or moving around, the dynamics of this system will settle into a near optimal Bayesian inference. My take on this is what I call the controlled hallucination, is really the claim that what we experience is the joint content of these predictive inferences. It's not a readout of the sensory data. And the term controlled hallucination, I think, makes any slogan is dangerous and can be misinterpreted, but and people often forget about the control, as if I'm saying that, we just our brains make up reality. That's not what I'm saying.
No.
In this view, reality is there. Our perceptual experiences are systematically related to it, but it's kind of like a hallucination because the experience comes from within, but it's controlled by sensory signals from the world.
So this is, we're talking about inference. I infer reality. I do not sort of perceive it as it is. Then now, and you write about this also, we call it active inference. So it's not just that could still be quite passively in a sense that I have the input data and then I have my generative model that gives me sort of the world. But now active inference says, no, it's somehow a loop or a continuously action. And I was thinking also how to understand this, but even my pupils, my eyes will be moving all the time. It's like constant. Is there a constant action to keep this going? Or what's active inference in this sense?
Yeah, so this term comes from Carl Friston, who's sort of taken this predictive view of the brain and run with it in ways which are really exciting, but also quite confusing sometimes.
Let's get to that later, yeah.
But active inference, the very simple way to think of active inference is indeed that you just augment this passive updating of predictions with the ability to act.
Yeah.
The active inference component brings something crucial to the table, which is control. So prediction is a slippery word. Prediction is often associated with like what's happening next, anticipation of the future. But it's actually, we can predict things in the present too. It can be thought of as filling in missing data. Predictive in the here and now, if my brain is making sense of the sensory signals, I'm not necessarily predicting what's going to happen. I'm just making a best guess about what's happening now through the exchange of predictions and prediction errors. But once you can predict, once you have a system that's able to predict sensory data, you have a system that's able to exert control as well.
Yeah.
Because you can now have a system, especially when it's the generative model includes action, you have a model that is able to predict what would happen to some sensory signal given some action. And this, I think, is absolutely key for cognition, perception, for how brains in general work. They're not just passively trying to form a Bayesian best guess. They're trying to exert optimal control of their own physiology and of the world around them. So if someone throws a ball, your brain is suddenly predicting what's going to happen and controlling your body so that you catch it.
Yeah.
That's for me the explanatory benefit of active inference.
I've been doing a lot of quantum mechanics interview, but it's like performing measurements on sort of an outside. Well, you have to perform measurements and then you update beliefs. That's what even in foundations of physics, people talk in terms like that, like updating beliefs on the basis of doing measurements in a sense, right?
Right.
It's a loose analogy, of course.
Yeah, but it makes sense. It makes sense. Once you bring action into the picture, you also have the possibility of making actions that might transiently increase prediction error, but they have the purpose of improving your generative model of the world.
Yeah.
So we would call this epistemic actions.
Yeah, indeed.
You might go into a new room, you might look around the room, and you're deliberately sort of exposing yourself to data that you might not expect. But by doing that, you're getting a better model of the environment that you're actually in. And this is where we begin to move from active inference to this thing called the free energy principle, And within that framework, we can begin to understand how our perceptual systems are continually sort of navigating this balance between minimizing sensory surprise, prediction error in the here and now, and minimizing it in the long run, which can involve like short-term, surprising things happening.
Yeah, there's so much here, but what I find fascinating is, let's move into the free energy principle, because that's just fascinating. I first of all, I thought sort of it really breaks my head, and I'll say this to Carl Friston because I am about to interview him as well on our channel, is that I find it sort of a very difficult term. Like, almost want to ask him if he doesn't regret calling it the free energy principle, as so many people find it hard to understand what it means free energy, right? Because as humans and in physics, free energy is a good thing, right? If you can get free energy to do work as a system, that's awesome. But he talks about minimizing it. How I understood it, but nice to just share my idea with you. From a Shannon sense, in Shannon information, of course, high information is high entropy, is also high energy to sort of just to store. If I cannot compress an image of the world, I need to it takes a lot of data to store. And in that sense, we don't want sort of spend all our energy as just creatures trying to survive on sort of modeling the world. So we want to reduce that and do that very efficiently. We want to zip the world low energy. So in that sense, we don't want a lot of energy, don't want free energy to be dumped on us by the world surprising us, right? So that's how I now try to think about the free energy principle. Is this sort of the right way to understand it?
I think it's one way, yeah. I mean, I must admit, just as sort of a little bit of the history of this idea from my perspective, I remember first, I was already interested in predictive processing maybe nearly 20 years ago now, and I remember reading some of the first papers on free energy from Carl Friston about 2007. I really struggled to understand, and we had...
I'm in good company.
We had, at the time, my colleague, who's still my colleague here, Chris Buckley, and I had a visiting physics professor from Korea, Chang-Sub Kim, and we were discussing what he might work on in the year or 6 months that he was going to spend with us. And we sort of hit on the idea of, let's just let's get to the bottom of this free energy principle. Let's just maybe write a short perspective or tutorial or commentary or something on this, because they're both physicists, and I can kind of follow along. And it took us 9 years to finish that paper. It was a struggle, and we ended up publishing it, a kind of mathematical review of the free energy principle. And so it's a long journey. It's a long journey, and even now, it's one of those things that I'm still not super confident that I understand, but that's fine. I think it's not everything is easy in the world, but the way you put it there is one way to understand it. So you can think of it, to connect it to our previous conversation, the idea of prediction error can be quite simple, right? The brain is making a prediction, maybe the prediction is a sort of a value within a distribution, and then it gets some sensory signal, and dependent on the precisions of these distributions, there'll be some difference, some error. That's the prediction error. You can use that to either drive action or update prediction. So then the free energy principle generalizes this kind of prediction error into a term of free energy. And once it's put like that, then you can kind of break it down in different ways. It sort of can be used to trade off different things, like accuracy and complexity, for instance. So, you could have a very complex model of the world, but that's going to prevent you from generalizing maybe to new data. And the idea of the free energy principle is it can be kind of partitioned in all these different ways that express useful trade-offs. And so it's a sort of richer framework for thinking about how predictive processing might be useful for an organism that is not just trying to reach a a perceptual inference right here and right now, but is trying to figure out what to do next, how to figure out, forage for new information from the world, or even how to plan a series of actions to reach some goal in the future. So it's a more general principle. I mean, it's a principle. I don't know. I'd be interested to hear whether he regrets calling it the free energy principle. But it's definitely a principle. I mean, one of the criticisms is that it's like, well, no, you can't test it, you can't falsify it. But that's kind of why it's called a principle. It's not.
It's very first principle even. I like it from that sort of physics perspective, because it's also beyond brains. It's just like in nature, it's about cells. It's even about society at large. I mean, right?
That's right. I mean, there's this principle of least action. It's sort of like how things sort of, how they choose the path of minimum action or energy through time.
Yeah.
It's what becomes testable. This, I suppose, is a bit of philosophy of science diversion, but process theories underneath the free energy principle should be testable. So something like predictive processing should be testable. And it is, in principle, testable, and we're getting there. So predictive processing is the more specific claim, that there is a generative model and predictions go in a particular way, and there's prediction errors and so on. Hard to get the data, but this is a claim about what actual things in the brain are actually doing.
Yeah.
So that's a process theory. It kind of follows from the free energy principle. Historically, it kind of came before it. But it is not the free energy principle. So if you falsify predictive processing, you don't thereby falsify the free energy principle.
But before I understand, but for people to understand the value of the free energy principle, for what sort of empirical data or just sort of phenomena can it account for better than predictive coding that doesn't sort of go back to these first principles that
I'm not so sure. It's hard to say from where I sit, like exactly what testable ideas have come up from that perspective that would not have come up otherwise. It's certainly put more emphasis on experiments that look at things like how we make eye movements to forage for new data, these kinds of things. In our own work, we've been very interested in like on the modeling side, for instance, we're interested in how computational agents might decide what sensory input to expose themselves to in order to best figure out what's going on. And that model was built on minimizing free energy in particular, rather than prediction error. And that model then makes some predictions about what people might do, but we haven't tested those yet. Another one is looking at this idea that actually when we first encounter a visual scene and we open our eyes, we have this very rapid perceptual take on our environment. Like we have this gist perception. I know I'm in a room without any details. And then we're trying to build a sort of extended model of predictive processing that accounts for that. And again, that sort of uses this variational free energy. Would we have done it without that? I don't know. For me, the main benefits are not yet directly empirical, but they're more conceptual and theoretical.
Yeah.
The free energy principle, from my perspective, is something that helps me join the dots between what the brain is doing when it's interpreting sensory information and processes that are just fundamental and core to living systems in general. And this is, I think, how to connect the two. So there's like, you can go in both directions. So one way to understand free energy and predictive processing is to say, start with what we've been talking about. The brain makes predictions to infer the causes of sensory signals. That's fine. Then we realize that actually these predictions also apply to the interior of the body too. So the brain is making predictions about sensory signals coming from its own physiology, interoceptive signals. These signals are these cycles of prediction and prediction error are more to do with control, because that's what
Yeah.
physiology, we need to keep our physiological
Yeah.
status within certain bounds in order to stay alive. And as we sort of go down through that, then we get to this more fundamental claim of the free energy principle, that anything that actively maintains itself within bounds can be described as minimizing free energy. Which brings us down to like that living systems just do this. They maintain themselves out of sort of statistical equilibrium with their environment. And they sort of have a statistical boundary which
these
partitions, these Markov blankets that
yeah.
So each of these things, there's lots of detail there, but conceptually, you can start from either direction. You can start from thinking, okay, if you have a system that is statistically distinct from its environment and that maintains itself in this equilibrium with its environment, then the free energy principle will say something like, such a system can be read as if it is minimizing the entropy of its sensory states.
Yeah.
And so that's just a basic condition. And then you can sort of go upwards from there to say, okay, that then systems can't directly minimize the surprise of sensory signals. They have to sort of minimize a proxy for that surprise, which turns out to be this free energy, which then under certain assumptions turns out to be the same thing as prediction error in predictive processing.
Yeah.
And you can kind of pick on that, many of these points. Like at one end, the free energy in question is more of a thermodynamic free energy. Living systems are thermodynamically out of equilibrium with their environment, whereas the free energy that we use in machine learning and visual inference is a more informational free energy, a variational free energy. So are they the same thing? Is it just analogous, or is there some deep continuity? And I think you can make a case that there's a deep continuity. There are things like the Landau principle and the various things from physics that connect thermodynamic concepts of free energy to informational concepts of free energy. But this is still something that in my mind is not completely transparent. I'm not sure it is in anybody's, but I think probably other people have a better idea of it than I do. But zooming right out, for me, it gives a very useful, but perhaps not completely adequate frame for connecting basic properties of life, like metabolism and autopoiesis, this property that living systems self-produce and self-maintain and self-sustain, to these same processes of prediction error minimization that underpin perceptual experience. And that's one reason that I tend to connect consciousness to life rather than to computation, something like that. I think it's a way of explaining why life might matter than just assuming it's some sort of vitalistic magic that enables consciousness.
Yeah, very nice to also touch upon computation and how you see sort of deeply being intertwined with life. But before doing that, I do want to sort of share with you sort of my metaphysical journey working for the Essentia Foundation, having the honor to talk to a lot of brilliant minds like you. I've had a lot of theories that on their surface reading to me were materialist. I know for instance, when I first encountered integrated information theory, I was like, oh, this is just a theory that tells me your mind is what the brain does, and it's just pointing to me where my brain exactly conscious experience emerges. To later find out in talking to, for instance, Christoph Koch and Giulio Tononi, that in a sense, wait a minute, it's agnostic, or perhaps even bending towards idealism in its core assumptions about reality. And the whole predictive coding and also Carl Friston's free energy principle are, for me, also compatible in a sense with idealism, just not the sort of naive idealism that people sometimes think of, like when they think, so everything's just an hallucination or it's not real.
Yeah.
Idealism doesn't say that. There is, of course, something that is real and objectively real. It just very most likely isn't physical. And also saying that because of my journey into foundations of physics, just talking to where the foundation of physics is with Bell inequality tests, that sort of a majority of physicists are sort of okay with the point saying that it's epistemic, right? We don't know what the wave function is. It's just about our knowledge, and we see sort of non-locality. So observer-independent physicality is not plausible, or you can do a lot of complicated math to uphold it, but it's just difficult. So I'm definitely lost in translation in all of this. But I'm super curious because you are sort of known as materialist, or it's on your Wikipedia page, and I had a conversation with...
Well, I didn't write my Wikipedia page, by the way.
You do have
also gets my birthday wrong. I get all these happy birthday messages at the wrong time.
Not the best source. Maybe a better source is Alex, your friend Alex Gomez-Marin, who calls you my materialist friend. And I must say, I did have a hard time to still see you as a materialist, Anil, just reading your book and all your thoughts. So I was super curious where you are right now, and if you still like that label.
So that's an interesting journey. And I mean, there's actually a lot that I would be sympathetic about.
Before hearing Anil Seth talk about metaphysics, I want to first tell you about the sponsor of this video. Consensus, an AI-powered science search engine that lets you search over 220 million scientific peer-reviewed papers with direct links to the studies. For instance, if I ask, does neuroscience tell us that we do not see reality as it is? Consensus immediately surveys hundreds of studies and presents me with a so-called consensus meter, where you can see that indeed the majority in neuroscience points to the fact that we do not see reality as it is. In preparing podcasts like these, Consensus is a great research tool for me to get fast insight in someone's work. For instance, while researching Anil Seth, I got a great summary of all his scientific papers. For instance, this paper in which he argues that AIs very likely are not conscious. So Consensus is a great tool, but it does not have feelings. What makes Consensus stand out in comparison to other AI tools is that it is scientifically completely rigorous, unclouded by blog posts, social media, or other pseudo-scientific sources. Consensus can be used for free, but if you want to have access to the full Pro features, you can click in the link below in the description. It will give you a 1-week free trial and a 30% discount on the first year thereafter. I want to close with an ethics statement. The Essentia Foundation is editorially completely independent, and we only work with sponsors that align with our mission and scientific standards. Now back to discussing metaphysics with Anil Seth.
My academic journey started off in physics. It's been sort of physics adjacent the whole time. And talking and reading stuff about foundations of quantum mechanics, it's kind of very clear that we've got no idea what reality actually is.
Yeah.
So to call myself a sort of materialist, I think, I'm not, you said there's a naive idealism, which is that everything is sort of hallucinated, nothing is real. The sort of naive materialism would be that, there's just sort of atoms bouncing around and we can explain everything in virtue of atoms bouncing into each other in particular ways. And we don't know what matter is. So to the extent that I am happy with being a materialist, it's a kind of materialist who is still very agnostic about what matter is that underlies this materialism. I think I'm a little bit with Sean Carroll, who prefers physicalism because it sort of avoids that baggage a little bit, and it's more a claim about, I think that, the universe exists, and it can be described, and the business of science is to describe the universe, and in the act of describing, we can understand and explain and predict its properties. And we do this mainly through, science thus far has been mainly a physicalist kind of enterprise where we make assumptions that we describe things in terms of their physical properties, their abilities to affect other things, and that's generally been quite successful. It unifies phenomena that might have been different before. Time and space and relativity and so on. It renders less mysterious things which might have been previously mysterious, like the nature of life, for instance. But what the university ultimately consists in, I don't really know. So I prefer to describe myself as a sort of pragmatic physicalist or materialist. I wear my metaphysics quite lightly.
Yeah.
And instead of, and this may just be unsatisfying, I mean, some people really want to address metaphysical questions head on, and sort of figure out which is right, if any, which ism should I live by.
Yeah.
I tend to be a bit more pragmatic, and I want to know which metaphysical perspective is most likely to deliver explanatory insight. And I have some conversations often. Alex is a good friend, and I have another a panpsychist friend, Philip Goff.
Oh yeah, I know.
And he will often say, all the things that science has discovered, they're all compatible with panpsychism. Yeah. I'm sure they're compatible with a sophisticated, maybe analytic idealism as well. Yes, that's true. But for me, the question is, would we have discovered these things if we had sort of panpsychist tendencies? Would we have done those experiments, come up with those theories? Maybe these theories are completely misleading us. Maybe we're actually getting more confused. I have the feeling we're getting less confused. And if that's right, if we are getting slightly less confused about the nature of things over time, then I'm happy to be a pragmatic physicalist.
It feels to me like this, what you're describing is sort of a profound, and I appreciate that, sort of a epistemic commitment to materialism, in the sense that it has been sort of a supposedly observer-independent universe with laws that govern it, that we can discover, predict, and describe in mathematics, has given us sort of just the miracles of science, and sort of brought us to where we are right now. So in that sort of the scientific method, if we relate that to the metaphysics of materialism, and you then say, I'm a pragmatic materialist, I can very much follow you there. But that sort of, to be very accurately, in a philosophic sense, I'd say that's an epistemic commitment to materialism. Because you also say, I'm a Kantian who sort of describes the difference between the phenomena and the noumena.
Right.
And then you also agree that you don't know what the noumena fundamentally are. You know that in how we do science, we describe them to be atoms, right? But that's a phenomenon of nature.
Right.
And you won't make that bridge, right? To say that is ontically sort of has an ontology.
I think the closest we can get, the people who have the best idea of what the noumenon might consist in is not a neuroscientist. It would be a physicist or a philosopher.
Yeah.
It certainly wouldn't be somebody like me. So I think that smells. I'm not unhappy with that. I think it is largely an epistemic view.
Yeah.
But I want to see what that leads to. Right. I want to see whether following that epistemically, it doesn't strike me that's necessarily going to result in an ontological commitment to physicalism. I mean, frankly, I'm still kind of fine with that as a sort of ontological preference in the background, because I just still don't really know what I'm signing up to, in a sense, because it does depend on what counts as matter, what counts as a physical stuff. And since that's unclear, I don't really feel like I'm painting myself into a corner. I think I would be if I assumed that what had fundamental ontological status was an atom or something like that. Then that would be probably, I wouldn't want to do that. But that's not what physicalism says, because it's
doesn't it?
Well,
I mean, to me, sort of that. I think
really?
what many people understand to be sort of what physicalism says, that it has sort of that. What we describe, how we describe our universe in particles, or now physics is of course now in sort of debate, because we get to fields and we get to exactly.
Yeah. So now, and now I'm way out of my wheelhouse, and I wouldn't even pretend to understand what quantum foam is all about. But that's I think that's my point, that physicalism surely depends, taken ontologically, it's surely going to depend on what we think is physical, and that's a moving target, and that's not really something I'm well qualified to investigate. I think the issue is that it's sort of, the suspicion seems to be, when you bring consciousness into the picture, right, that it just seems to puzzle people that that physicalism could have the resources to account for consciousness, right? People might be happy or happier with the idea that other things in nature could ultimately be, or sufficiently be explained by physicalist perspective.
We want to be special in a sense. We want that special sauce of.
I think this is part of it. There's for whatever reason, I think historically there has been this idea that that consciousness is just not the kind of thing that physicalism has the resources to account for. And this has been expressed in philosophy many times. Thomas Nagel talks about this, that science normally travels from subjectivity to objectivity, but when we try to understand consciousness, we're trying to go back in the other direction. You have the hard problem of David Chalmers. You have all kinds of zombie arguments and things like that. You've got all kinds of things which try to motivate the idea that there's going to be something specifically resistant about consciousness to a physicalist explanation. You also have, I think, the more psychological factors about, well, what do we expect from a scientific explanation of, or an explanation of consciousness? It has the particular property that we are trying to explain ourselves to some extent. We're trying to explain something that we are, that we instantiate, not some external phenomenon. And I think we've got to be really careful about not setting the bar implicitly higher because of that. There's sometimes the idea that an explanation of consciousness has to make intuitive sense. But we don't ask that of other areas of science in order for them to be treated as adequate theories. We sometimes do with consciousness. Why? Because we are conscious, I think. So when we kind of equalize the explanatory bar and say we want to, maybe what do we ask of a theory? We want it to explain phenomena, why they are the way they are, perhaps why they exist at all, but certainly why they are the way they are. We want to predict when they happen and maybe control them as well, if they are available for control. If we can do that, then I think we're creating a science of consciousness. And it doesn't have to make intuitive sense, at least not in the first instance. So for me, it's physicalism may well have the resources to do it. An example of this is like, even if we did want some intuitive sense to apply, if you just think of like atoms, then okay, well, why should atoms bouncing around ever result in any kind of experience? It seems difficult. It is difficult, but that doesn't mean it's out of the game altogether. The brain is very, very complicated. As a physical system, if we treat it as a physical system, the kinds of things it might be capable of are very hard to intuit from where we stand now. And even from where we stand now, in the way I've been sort of considering it for the last 3 years, and not 3 years, 10 years or something like that, and thinking about actually the fact that basic life processes might play into this story about consciousness. Suddenly it seems maybe a little bit more intuitive that things that, cells that are continually reproducing themselves, that through the process of metabolism generate electric fields which sort of provide a readout of the physiological condition of that cell that then integrates across multiple cells in ways that can guide action. Suddenly it's not so much of a leap to think that something like that might have an interiority. There might be something it might be like to be that kind of thing. And this is still very, very early days.
And I mean, but I could again agree in the sense that, but I say the best you could arrive at is sort of like a very complete map of what it really is. So, and I like that about IIT, that it says it starts off with sort of this clean Cartesian way of thinking, that the only thing I really know for sure is that I have consciousness, and everything from there, like everything, all the science we do, all the whole theory of active inference has to take place within sort of consciousness. So it sort of also boomerangs back at itself, because if sort of that tells us that everything's only an inference, the whole theory of course, is also just an inference. It's this loop we are trapped in. And I like that sort of, it's very clean for me to stay with sort of the first move of Descartes, of course, not sort of the introduction of the res extensa, and then to make that cut, of course, then we ended up in dualism. That's sort of a detour. Yeah. But that first movement I really very much like. IIT does that, but then I think maybe I realize that now in what I told you now in my journey. Then reading IIT, but you think, hey, wait a minute, but this also is like a materialist theory in that it really looks at sort of just brains, just it's about neurons, how they're interconnected. It's about the math of that all. But then it says, and that's also where I had a hard time. Curious also, good question to you. What it arrives then at is, it then says, I have an explanatory identity. That's the word they use with their 5 structures, right? What they qualia. Right. Super complex mathematics, and you can unfold that in sort of like a diamond structure, and you say, okay, this is my full experience of holding this cup. Is this. How I get that, you just arrived at the best description, the most accurate full description of it, but it is not the thing in itself. So it is sort of the most accurate third-person description science can give us of the noumena. But it is not the thing in itself. So I still am back with consciousness must be fundamental. So that's where I am.
That last step, that's the step I don't really know how you would get to. I mean, so IIT for me, it is really fascinating. It doesn't fit so cleanly into any of our categories, I don't think, because it starts with consciousness, right? Yeah. So consciousness exists is the first axiom. And then it has some other axioms about...
for itself, it also says like truly
exists for itself. Yeah, exists intrinsic. That's right. It exists for itself, and then there's it's unified, it's integrated, it's exclusive, and so on. And you can maybe quibble with how axiomatic these supposed axioms really are, but it's certainly taking a phenomenal realist point of view. It's not illusionist, right? So consciousness exists. In fact, it's the only thing we can be 100% sure of as existing. But then it's making a series of claims through its postulates about the properties that physical systems would need to have to satisfy these phenomenal axioms. And when a physical system does that, integrates information in the right way, has the right cause-effect structure, then it will entail a conscious experience rather than generate one or produce one. The fact that cause-effect structure exists in physical terms entails a phenomenal experience. Yeah,
so we have the phenomenal description, and we know there must be a noumenon that corresponds with it, in a sense. Yeah.
Right. And, where I think I am still, I'm not entirely clear whether I understand IIT on this point is its claim about, the ontological status of the physical cause-effect structure that entails the phenomenal experience. Does it exist at all or not?
That's difficult. That's where it really gets difficult because then you're hitting on that sort of explanatory identity. But I do think, again, that's a move away from ontology. You're not saying it's the thing in itself. It's not an ontic identity. So I truly have it there, the conscious experience, and that's it. No, you're saying it's a sort of explanatory, so sort of descriptive identity, which is again epistemic, which is again about phenomena.
But you see, that to me, so it would need Giulio or Christoph here to sort of pin their colours to the mast.
We're having these discussions. I love it.
But I think you read me quite right that I am naturally more comfortable with this epistemic, more pragmatic view. And in fact, some of the work we've done over the years at Sussex with my colleagues Adam Barrett and Pedro Mediano and others is to distinguish this like strong IIT from weak IIT. So strong IIT is the sort of Giulio Tononi, Christoph Koch flavor, which is making a very strong identity claim, whether it's an ontic identity or a different kind of identity, that's for them to determine. But there's a very strong claim of an identity relationship of some kind.
Yeah.
But when you sign up to that, you might be right. I don't know. Let's just set aside whether they're in fact correct or not. But it becomes very, very difficult to operationalize, to do anything with. So, for example, if you want to compute as a scientist now, looking at a system on the basis of IIT, and you want to compute something related to phi, you kind of need to know everything the system could do, even if it never does it. Because that's fundamental to the quantity that has the identity relationship with consciousness, right? It's based on the maximum entropy repertoire and so on. This is almost impossible to do for anything apart from really toy systems, which is why a lot of the modeling for IIT is very, very simple systems. There are other ways to think of IIT.
There are proxy measures they've developed, right, to sort of probe the brain and sort of...
I'm glad you said that. There are proxy measures, but there are no approximation measures of this. I mean, maybe there will be, but it's... So a proxy is something that stands in, but it doesn't asymptote towards the value. Like, GDP is a proxy for economic health of a nation, but, Newtonian mechanics is an approximation for relativity theory. It's much more systematic relationship. One of the issues is things that are often offered as evidence for IIT are definitely compatible with it, but they're usually proxies rather than approximations, and they would in fact be compatible with other theories. So things like the perturbation complexity index. So, you zap the brain with TMS, you record the EEG that happens, the EEG echo, and then you compress it and you get a value, the perturbation complexity index. It's an amazing series of studies led by Marcello Massimini, a colleague of Tononi's over years. I think they're fantastic studies. And they're certainly inspired by IIT, and they're compatible with it. And they may be more compatible with it than with other theories. But the PCI is not an approximation of phi. Right? It's a stand-in, it's a proxy. The relationship's quite weak. However, if you treat the whole thing a bit more pragmatically, or maybe then you don't have to make the strong identity relation, and it becomes much easier to compute quantities that still capture some of the same essential insights, like this balance of integration and differentiation. But you can now do it on the basis of for instance, of what the system actually does, rather than what it might have done under an arbitrary number of perturbations. So this is kind of what we call, and this was led by Adam and Pedro, weak IIT. And I think for me, this is where I just naturally feel more comfortable, because it actually goes right back to even before IIT. So I did my postdoc in San Diego with Gerald Edelman, actually thinking and hoping that Tononi was going to be there, but by the time I got there, he left. And their paper from 1998 was one of the papers that I read. I was finishing my PhD here at Sussex at the time, halfway through or something. And this it really opened my mind, because it was called Consciousness and Complexity, Science 1998. And it said, a very short paper, it said, we need to get beyond just merely looking for neural correlates of consciousness. This part of the brain, that part of the brain, which is what Christoph Koch was doing at the time.
With Francis Crick.
With Crick, before he moves it towards IIT. Because correlations by themselves don't really give you explanatory insight. And so they would say, we need to come up with richer mathematical bridges that give us explanatory links between things happening in brains and things and properties of experience. And their initial proposal was neural complexity, which was this way of balancing. If you look at a whole system composed of many elements, you can measure its balance of integration and differentiation. And so they said you can do this for networks of elements in a system, maybe brain regions or neurons or whatever. And in terms of phenomenology, they didn't call it axiomatic at that point, but they said experiences in general have this property that they're integrated and they're also differentiated. And this for me was like, yes, this is the way. It's not making a super strong claim that consciousness is neural complexity, but it's saying there's this property of conscious experience which has phenomenological grip. It tells us something interesting about experience. And there's a way of operationalizing that in a way that you can decide whether a certain physical process exhibits that property or not.
Yeah.
That's the perspective I still prefer when it comes to IIT.
Yeah, and that's the one also I find cool in a sense, how it can make accurate predictions. That's why I think it's a true scientific theory of consciousness, because it's falsifiable in... I mean, you just mentioned how complex it is, but that, of course, in the end, is not a reason.
No.
I mean, because these sort of... In quantum mechanics, the thought experiments in the foundations of physics are also sort of, we cannot by far execute them, but they're super relevant to just progressing physics, because we might in 20 years, and then they might sort of just bring us, you know, the next revolution in mankind. So that's amazing. But what IIT already could do, what helped me understand, is sort of just give clarity on for instance, the difference between the cerebrum and cerebellum. We had an interview with Jeremiah Hendren, who worked with Giulio Tononi, and that to me was like astonishing to just see, okay, you have a theory that tells me it's all about that crosstalk of neurons integration, and then you can actually say, okay, where do we see that in the brain, or where we don't see it, and if we don't see it in this, and the prediction, at least according to the theory, then is right. But please let me know what you think, that the cerebellum should not sort of be has a lower phi, so probably isn't involved in consciousness, and that is exactly what sort of we see empirically. So that I really like, and then it can say stuff about LLMs being conscious or not. So
wow,
right?
Yeah, I think the other reasons why LLMs are not conscious. I mean, but
okay, let's move there. But at least we're just touching on sort of the value of IIT as a scientific theory. But yeah.
Well, I want to dwell on that for a second longer, if I might. I think you're right, and it's always, when I talk about consciousness to very new audiences, it's one of those facts that is eternally surprising, that the cerebellum has 70 to 80% of all the neurons in our brain, yet it doesn't seem to have anything to do with consciousness. It's very much. It's like, wow, that's just extraordinary. And indeed, IIT gives an account of why. It's a post-diction rather than a prediction, right? Because we already knew that.
Yeah.
And other theories of consciousness would also probably be able to tell you a story about that too. IIT does it very cleanly, but it's not, it's not like, oh my goodness, like that's not compatible with like global workspace theory, for instance. The cerebellum's poorly, constructed to support something like a global workspace.
Okay.
But so there's that. But the test of, the value of a theory is not only in what it can post-dictively account for, it's, I think, more in whether it makes distinct and testable predictions going forward. So two things I want to say here. One is the weak kind of IIT things are testable, right? The PCI index, if it goes down when people regain consciousness, well, that's something wrong about that. That's evidence against the theory, or any of the other measures of phi that my colleagues Adam and Pedro and Fernando and others develop. If they go, down as people regain consciousness, that would be evidence against it. But that's evidence against these weak versions, and then you might just change, you iterate and update, and that's fine. I mean, that's by the way, that's why I think IIT is really in the game of science. It's definitely a scientific thing, because it can motivate testable predictions which have explanatory insight. Even the kind of the stronger IIT though still can generate interesting testable predictions. So but there's a collaboration I'm have only a very minor kind of advisor role in, is trying to test a prediction that I don't think would come naturally for other theories of consciousness, which is that it should make a difference to a system's conscious experience whether a neuron or a set of neurons is not only inactive, to say not firing, but inactivated, so cannot fire. This is kind of a subtle distinction, right?
Interesting, yeah.
Imagine you've got some neurons in your visual cortex.
Yeah.
They're not firing because there's nothing driving them in the world. It's like completely no input.
Yeah.
Right? Just imagine for the sake of argument, baseline activity is 0, which is not true. This is one of the experimental difficulties. Nothing is actually 0. There's background.
Yeah.
These neurons are not firing because they're not getting input. Now imagine you do some clever optogenetics or something, and you inhibit them from firing. So even if there was an input, they still wouldn't fire. Now, in both cases, the neuron is not firing.
Yeah.
So, most theories would probably say, well, my experience should be the same. The neuron is not firing, so
yeah,
that shouldn't make a difference. IIT predicts it does make a difference because the underlying cause-effect structure has changed of the physical system.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Right? That's kind of cool and counterintuitive, and is not a million miles from testability, because we do have optogenetics. We can inactivate inactive neurons. So a group in Holland, actually, led by Umberto Olcese, it's part of one of these adversarial collaborations, is trying to do exactly this with rodents that are trained to make a visual discrimination. And then they're given an optogenetic manipulation such that part of their visual field that is not stimulated by sensory input is inactivated. And then we see, does it make a difference to their visual perception or not? It's a rodent, you can't ask them detailed phenomenology, but you can train them to poke their nose left or right. It turns out to be extremely difficult. But as you just said, the fact that something's extremely difficult and complex, when we're talking about whether something is, that kind of doesn't matter. That's just like, we'll just get better at it.
Exactly.
And then we'll do it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's what I like about sort of in physics, that you have to spend decades of work on experiments that probably in your lifetime cannot be sort of done. But I mean, that's sort of the whole story of the Bell inequality test. That's Einstein worrying about all of that in his lifetime, and it's just like 80 years later. Now we have quantum computers due to exactly that line of thinking. Absolutely. I love it. And
we're so early on when it comes to the brain, and in some ways I hate saying this because it sounds sort of defeatist and like an excuse, but it's just true. I mean, the ability we have to, the brain from one perspective, it's kind of, you think it's easy. Like, there are many brains in the world to study, not just one. They're kind of human scale, and we can manipulate. They're not the other side of the universe. We don't need like massive telescopes or accelerators to study them. But I think what makes them difficult is a dimension of complexity. We just don't have the concepts, the mathematical tools, the experimental apparatus to deal with the complexity of the brain. And as we develop these tools, and they're coming, optogenetics gives us a granularity of experimental intervention that we didn't have before. And we're developing lots more, exciting mathematical tools that are well suited to these kinds of complex systems. I think progress will accelerate. But I think this brings me back to the metaphysics thing. Like, I often encounter sort of this deep pessimism about a physicalist approach to consciousness. And I was just like, come on. The brain is a really complex system. It's early days. Don't write it off yet. I don't think, there may be independent reasons why you might favor analytic idealism or panpsychism. But the fact that materialism or physicalism hasn't yet delivered a theory of consciousness shouldn't be one of the reasons.
Yeah, again, I think that's a divide between the two. I sort of remain in the position that I love the brain and its complexity as I love it sort of as a symbol, and I don't think it's just fundamental, because the only thing I truly know is that I have a phenomenal experience of the world, and that's my starting point. That's, I guess, my answer. Does that make sense to you?
It makes sense, but it seems like a huge leap from the one hand saying I don't know what fundamentally exists to saying I know consciousness exists, therefore consciousness is what fundamentally exists.
It's the only sort of...
That seems like a leap to me. Why should the fact that the one thing you know about be the thing that's fundamental?
No, that's fair enough. I think you're right in a sense that I have to be super careful. We all have to be, but it's just like from a sort of Occam's razor's perspective in not wanting to introduce new categories ontically. If I stay with my clean Cartesian view, the only thing I know is that I have a phenomenal experience of the world. That's the only thing I can be truly sure of. The only thing is that's that. Then there is a world that appears to be observer independent of me. But now I have to be super careful to introduce a new metaphysical category, namely that of observer-independent particles. So let's be very careful and only make that step if we truly have to. And I think the misconception around idealism is that people think that in physics you have to make that assumption. But physicists now themselves tell us you don't have to assume an observer-independent universe. We can do the mathematics, we can run the experiments within an idealist metaphysics, if you like. But in the end, and that's what I like about your epistemic approach, it doesn't really matter to sort of in the foundation that it is philosophy.
Okay.
But I mean, just cleanly philosophy, like just analytically, why introduce a new metaphysical category? If I start just with the only thing I know, my consciousness, and I say, then it's pretty plausible, as long as I can uphold it and it's compatible with science, to not introduce a new category.
I mean, then that kind of puts the pressure on, okay, so the fact that we have pragmatically introduced these categories,
Yes.
posited the existence of things like particles, fields, neurons, whatever they are, that's led to a lot of explanatory insight.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
So I want to know, imagine we start a controlled experiment now. We've got a bunch of neuroscientists, physicists, philosophers, whatever, two groups. One of them, like analytic, they're convinced by your perspective. They think, well, I'm not going to think about observer-independent particles or particles, whatever. Just things are fundamentally made of mental states.
Yeah.
And then you have people like me who say, well, I'm just going to assume for now that things are made of physical, there are physical properties and processes, whatever they may be. And then we run the tape forward 100 years and we see, okay, which group of people have sort of delivered more explanatory insight? I don't know what the answer would be, but people who've taken a sort of physicalist perspective on things so far have generated a lot of explanatory insight. And that seems to be working quite well. I don't see any reason why consciousness, it is difficult in some specific ways, but I don't think it defeats the purpose. I don't think it cuts it off at the knees at all, right? So I want to see. And my suspicion is that the kind of convenient fictions of whether they're neurons or whatever it might be that are constructions about what ultimately might be there. Explanations framed in those terms might lead us to very differently conceive of the problem of consciousness in ways that are more satisfying.
Yeah.
But maybe I'm wrong. I'm not really. Maybe IIT is one example here of how having a different kind of metaphysical perspective has led to a different theory, which may explain things in a different way. But in general, I keep hearing that everything is compatible with idealism or panpsychism, and yeah, fine. Of course, it's easy to be compatible with something, but you have to have that thing that it's compatible with in the first place. And would you get that? Would we have had the history of scientific insight? If we'd been, we might even be metaphysically right, but then not do anything.
I very much like this because I like that. It's very nice and it's so funny. I knew when I would sit down here, because we don't have very often guests on our channel that are sort of like defending, may I say that in a sense, sort of this position. I really like it, and also sort of I'm a storyteller, right? I'm trying to make a story out of all of this, trying to really understand it. I couldn't agree more that convenient fiction. Let's say it started with Descartes, introducing a new metaphysical category, which I just critiqued him for, right? I say, I don't think that's...
the res extensa, res cogitans.
I think you're putting a trick on yourself there. But a very pragmatic one that can be sort of like super useful. It has been great because, indeed, you could also say that idealism, let's call it naive idealism, if I critique naive idealism, hasn't always done our planet and humanity and the whole living planet well. I mean, just look at the wars waged between countries and peoples who had different beliefs that very much foundationally were sort of idealists in a sense. So that move, I think, has been historically like valuable. the only thing I find so interesting and cool about the times we're living in is that now science does, in the foundations of physics, we are hitting this conundrum that the cut we once thought we could make between mind and matter is smashed. I mean, the glass is broken, as John Wheeler puts it, the physicist. I love that quote. The glass is broken, you know, the glass of us sitting behind the microscope. So we now know we're trapped in something that we're participating in. And I see that in active inference. And then, of course, metaphysically, we're sort of back. Hey, wait a minute. We started with idealism. Then we had this period of materialism. But we know something smashed here. So now we're in sort of this wordplay. And we need sort of analytic philosophers. Bernardo is sort of the person here to. But I just find that story interesting. But getting back to your question, can sort of course, that burden is on analytic idealism if it claims to be a more plausible metaphysics to deliver us sort of to do everything and more and better, because that's what a paradigm shift needs to do, right? The next paradigm needs to include everything of the previous paradigm and more. That more, like very hardcore, I see in the foundations of physics when it comes to these extended Wigner-French scenarios, like difficult stuff where you just know if I keep sort of this ontic view on the wave function, we get into sort of deep trouble. Trouble I don't understand. I just have to assume the physicists telling it to me are right, that they say, you get into a lot of trouble if we stay in this ontic interpretation, just mathematically.
What, like the wave function exists?
Yeah, it's like the many worlds. For some of these,
exactly.
If you want to keep in that many worlds, one sort of real universe out, okay, I can give it to you, but it's going to get, and it's so much more clean and neat if we just say the wave function is epistemic. So then you already see sort of the value of a different metaphysics in just your mathematics. A more important one, but a more difficult one also is, of course, and super curious on your thoughts here, it's just the meaning of it all. I mean, life after death, people having sort of transcendent experiences and who have always felt that sort of materialist science tells them it's an illusion, it's an hallucination, or like the out-of-body experience, it's just all the psi phenomena, all of that. Idealism cannot give you like a direct mechanism. Bernardo will also be like very honest on that, not yet. But at least it's compatible with all these phenomena, and materialism does seem to have a problem there, or at least in some of these cases.
A problem, well, it depends on a problem for whom and a problem for what. You know, I think if what people want is something to cling on to about the persistence of their consciousness after death, then there's going to be a problem, because that's probably not going to happen. And here's what I think is useful here about this pragmatically materialist view is I think actually helped us in this sense. It helps us in a way that, you know, for instance, like Buddhism has been saying for a long time, and people in meditative traditions have gone after for a long time, which is that, you know, even the self that we are now is changing, it's impermanent. You know, nothing lasts, everything changes. We don't worry about all the time before we were born that we weren't there. And why are we so concerned about the time after? You know, we're not there either. From our perspective, it's equally non-existent. You know, we're here now. And that's enough. And the challenge, I think, is not to find a way in which we can kind of, you know, find a workaround through some alternative metaphysics or some strange, unusual experiences that gives us a door into persisting beyond death, but to recognize that the human condition is transient. The condition of all things is transient. And we need to just become better at being human beings, I think, that way. And I don't know what I'll feel like, you know, the moment before I die or the week before I die. Maybe I'll, you know, there's Pascal's wager. Maybe you start behaving all kind of crazy things just in case. Yeah? But what I hope is that, you know, I'm not too distressed about it, and that that there's a recognition that just as myself right now, there's no essence of it. It's a process. It's this collection of controlled hallucinations that are grounded in my body and its fundamental drive to stay alive. That that's it. And when that process comes to an end, and I become in statistical equilibrium with my environment, then there is no me. But that's okay, because I'm changing from day to day anyway, and there's no suffering and oblivion, there's no pain, there's just nothing. This is not an easy thing. We can't. I was talking to. I hope it's okay to bring this up. I was talking to. So my mother has been ill for a long time. I wrote about her briefly in my book.
Yeah, I can remember.
And she died last year. And
so sorry to hear that.
She was 90. It was no tragedy, but I still miss her desperately. And I was, the only family, so I spent a lot of time with her and helping her and so on. And we had a number of philosophical conversations. And we had a lot of conversations about death. And I asked her several times, or she volunteered, she couldn't, even though she knew she was close to death, she couldn't imagine not existing. It's a reflexively impossible thing to do. It's like a cognitively impossible object, isn't it? Because to imagine, it's back to the Descartes thing. If you can imagine something, you are imagining, you're there to do the imagination. The closest I think you can get, and that's how I start the book, is this sort of post hoc description of anesthesia as the closest any of us will get to just not being there. The ends join up, you're gone, you're back. There's no experience of absence, there's only absence of experience. And if I think about things that way, then it just sort of increases my sense of wonder about existing in the here and now. I think to me that's a much more desirable, I don't want to follow motivated reasoning. I don't want to sort of choose my metaphysics in order to make my science to make myself feel most comfortable. But all the same, I do think that this sort of materialist view, it's not denuding, it's not diminishing, it only drains hope of things which we shouldn't really be hoping for in the first place. And I think of these days, there's this, I think, rather unseemly desire for immortality that's sort of animating some of our, our most influential tech leaders and things like that, and not all of them, but certainly there's a flavor of this kind of digital rapture, singularity mongering, mind uploading, sort of just unholy mess of well, it's not unholy, it's very holy actually, but it's a kind of religion for people without religion. But there's something about wanting to escape the messy confines of our living bodies and exist forever that I like. Okay, let's try and live long and healthy lives, but don't try and upload yourself to the cloud. That's not, I don't think it's going to work. Yeah. And it's not, and for me, that would not be a desirable way to live in the here and now either. So for me, there's a spiritual satisfaction to thinking about consciousness as a material process that's part of what it is to be a living organism. That's not diminishing. It's a beautiful thing.
So nice to hear this from you. It's very nice to hear this from you, because I can sense the depth in that worldview as well. And a lot of this is, of course, words. I mean, I can debate you now and sort of give you my idealist story on it. What I'm hearing is that you're also truly, maybe call it sort of a way to phrase it, but you're honoring form. If I say whatever reality truly is, the form that we can sense is our body, and it is being here now. That's the form in which the universe now presents itself to us. It's you and me sitting here, a sense of self with all we know. And your commitment to truly understanding that sort of and staying here with it, with what we can perceive, I see sort of as an honoring of that form. And the only thing I think that fundamentally there's something behind that form that is truly me. And the depth, I tried to get at this analytically, but more experientially, it has been sort of it has been psychedelics, yeah, after like a Christian upbringing that told me a dualist story that I couldn't live with. And in a sense, even I see this strange parallel between what some of the religions do and and the materialism I critique, right, that they take something to be too literal. But I don't see you as a literal materialist. I see you sort of like a more epistemic one, honoring all of this. But anyways,
and I think it's important also to be a critical of some naive expressions of materialism. And there's just, I want like a slight, I think, but currently very important sidebar here is, for instance, the idea that AI could be conscious is often associated with a kind of physicalist perspective. There's this, okay. But physicalism, I don't think is either necessary or sufficient for that view. And I think I totally disagree with that idea. So, there's a more specific claim, which is that computation is enough for consciousness. But that's a very, very specific view. It's certainly not coextensive with physicalism or materialism. Like, in fact, it's completely opposed to the view which I find more appealing, which is that consciousness has this intimate connection with life. So that's just I think just wanted to put that on the table, that there are versions of materialism which I think do deserve criticizing, because they sort of load onto it other things which are optional, and which may well be wrong.
And so that would also be like computational functionalism.
That's right.
If we can sort of just run the functions on a Turing machine, we have the real things.
Correct.
We can simulate consciousness, we have
That's
consciousness.
the idea.
Exactly.
What would lead me to sort of change my my predilection from pragmatic physicalism? I think, this idea of, okay, so what will analytical idealism do for the world? Will we gain more explanatory insight? If it turns out that metaphysics leads to theories that lead to experiments that shed explanatory insight, give us predictive power, then I'll change my mind. Or if there's good evidence for phenomena that physicalism just simply cannot account for. But I don't think there is yet. I just think the fact that it's not accounted for yet is not strong enough for me.
I think maybe before sort of what it can explain, if it can do it, to me it's sort of the questions we permit ourselves to. So what questions can we sort of really ponder on the idea that our brains are a filter of consciousness, that there is a field of consciousness that our brain somehow filters? Sort of, I'm curious if you think that's like a serious question for science to sort of jump into, because I think a lot of people who are like truly committed to sort of materialism in a more naive sense would say no, because there's no mechanism at all to sort of assume that sort of, and they sort of just even a sense of allergy. So for sort of open-mindedness on these phenomena, psi phenomena, also in quantum, there's a number of these phenomena that you could sort of account for if you would have more open-minded questions. So that would be my sort of reply.
Okay, so so I suppose there are two things to say about this. This idea of the brain being a filter for consciousness rather than being the kind of thing that entails conscious experiences. By the way, I tend to stick away from the brain producing consciousness. Sometimes I say that by accident, but I think it's not. That smuggles in a kind of dualism when you say the brain produces. But so if the brain is a sort of filter for consciousness that's there anyway, all around us, one thing I would like to know is, what would look different about the brain under that view compared to the view, the more pragmatic physicalist view that the brain is the causal basis of consciousness? That's one question. Maybe there's an answer to it. The other thing that you suggest is, well, there are these phenomena, whether they're psi phenomena or other kinds of unusual experiences, or even behavioral demonstrations of things that are very difficult to account for if one assumes that a conscious experience is somehow locally determined by the brain, even though the form of it may be influenced by other things. So I think there's been this long history. So Alex Gomez-Marin and I talk about this a fair bit, and it's fascinating. And I'm going to say one thing that I know he hates when people say, which is that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
Yeah.
And I don't think the evidence is sufficiently strong for these things yet. I think there are other explanations that account for much of the data, certainly the experiential data. Out-of-body experiences, again, are a really good example. Here I say another thing that Alex hates, which is we should take these experiences seriously, but not literally. They matter for the people that have them. I'll defend it, though, because I think it's right. You know, they matter for the people that have them. They're very powerful experiences. They happen. But we shouldn't confuse the content of a conscious experience with an insight into the nature of reality directly. And the fact that we can generate an out-of-body experience by stimulating the brain, you know, the temporoparietal junction, stick an electrode in there, you get an out-of-body experience. That seems to suggest that what we should want to know is not just like what happens in an out-of-body experience, but how come the brain is always doing something that gives us a sense of having a first-person perspective on the world. And that, for me, just it reveals a richer picture of what consciousness is like. So now we don't take it for granted. And that's an enriching picture. So the fact that we don't take the content of an out-of-body experience literally doesn't mean that we end up kind of denuding of its meaning and significance. Actually, we come to a richer picture, I think, of what's going on in any conscious experience. And I think the same thing applies for many other unusual experiences.
As I say, as a filmmaker exploring all of this as science journalist, I don't have the time to read all of the literature. I do know that there's trouble with a lot of the psi literature. It's going to be reproduced. And I know there are problems with some of these studies. I also know what Alex Gomez's work on The Blind Man Who Can See is very compelling to me. Very compelling to me. And it's such an example of I've read studies when people are retroactively primed. So they've done experiments, and that sort of it's controlled for because the priming has been done retroactively, and then we see sort of statistically that still people sort of perform above average. You know, it's super strange stuff. Whereas in idealism, it's easier at least to just openly ask the question. If all is mind, there are mind states outside of me, and I have a Markov blanket. Exactly as Carl Friston says, or I have a phi structure exactly as Christoph Koch says, but I could access a mind at large when sort of that boundary is solved, or in my own psychedelic experiences, I see that becoming more porous and it enters. And then that just is a model that then accounts for me for all these phenomena, but that does not sort of relieve me from the burden to then, of course, come up with good theory that makes accurate predictions, and that is falsifiable. So I couldn't agree more there. Yeah. So I'm talking metaphysics here, but and I think that's just an interesting debate we're in. Yeah,
I think it's important to have these discussions. Yeah. Alex and I co-wrote a paper last year about IIT.
Defending it, or basically
defending its right to exist.
Yeah.
It has the right to be wrong, I think, was the way we put it. But, again, one of those cliches that keep an open mind, but not so open that your brains fall out. That I think I would welcome, very, very rigorous experimental efforts to evidence phenomena that would be very difficult to account for. I don't want to there's a risk to this, I think, because once you start doing that, then you kind of license the view that these phenomena really do exist. You already give the impression there's a there. There might not be a there at all. But I think that's a price worth paying. To see, and I put a lot of money on not finding things if the experiment was done sufficiently, with enough data. I mean, you talk about physics, the sort of sigma levels people put in experimental physics when they really want to say something that challenges the standard model. They're enormously high standards, and I think that's right. That's applying reason and evidence. If we can be good Bayesians, we can be good reasoning machines, whatever metaphysics we prefer. And if we abide by those principles, then I think we'll be doing the right thing. And if it turns out there's huge amounts of evidence that there's retrodiction or phenomena, extrasensory perception of some kind, or for instance, there's experiments with out-of-body experiences that people try to see whether if someone who experienced themselves floating above their bodies could see things that would not be visible from their physical body.
Exactly. These studies, if I'm not wrong, I have to research this. There are studies done in this direction. There is compelling evidence.
I think but that's the thing. I think there I know there's studies being done. I don't think the evidence is remotely compelling. I'm just trying to lay out a hypothetical situation which might lead me to at least question my own current position, which would be if there was evidence that somebody had an out-of-body experience, they can see all these things which would have been impossible for them to see from their physical body or know about in any way. That would be very challenging for me. So,
you try to avoid saying that the brain produces consciousness, right? But what is a different word then to use? Because you wouldn't agree that it is consciousness like IIT claims. So what then exactly is the word you do want to use there?
I'm not sure the right word exists, or that maybe it exists. Not sure which it would be. I want to remain a bit agnostic about that relationship. We know empirically there's a very strong, intimate relationship. The brain activity changes, conscious experience changes. That's one of the constraints we have when we try to understand the phenomenon. It's easy, I think, to slip into implicit sort of metaphysical positions when we say produces or gives rise to or emerges from, when each of these terms requires greater specification. Like emergence, for instance, I think is super interesting, but it's not like emergence in a sort of
strong
spooky way, and it's not even emergence in terms of a flock of birds being a flock. I think it's actually a really interesting kind of mathematical concept that we can unpack in all sorts of ways. I think possibly the closest word is something like entailment. So there are plenty of other examples where the molecular structure of the protein, the amino acid structure of a protein entails a certain shape, which entails a certain function. There's a non-arbitrariness. You couldn't swap things around and it still sort of do the same things or have the same properties. That's, I think, a closer, that's a better word. So that consciousness just is if you fix the physical properties in a particular way, then it's non-arbitrary that there will be a conscious experience.
And sort of the classic philosophical zombie arguments would say we would have an exact physical copy on silicon, or that would, but like with neuromorphic AI, we could make an exact copy. Would we have sort of a conscious entity? Would it be a conscious being?
Yeah, I mean, I really, really don't like conceivability arguments. I think they're very unconvincing because they're mainly predicated on systematically not knowing enough about a system. So the zombie argument, it depends whether you sort of think of it as conceptual or nomological, given the laws of physics, as they are. But the idea that you could have a physically identical system to you and me, but without conscious experiences. I mean, I can think about that. I can imagine me kind of walking around and being in a state subjectively equivalent to general anesthesia. But, I think it's very unlikely that that's actually possible, certainly given the laws of nature and the laws of physics as we have them. I don't think it's sufficiently evident that we can base any strong conclusions on it. It's like, I can imagine an Airbus flying backwards. I can just think of it. There's a sky, I can imagine a plane flying backwards. But as soon as I know anything about aerodynamics, engineering, planes can't fly backwards. That's just not the kind of thing they can do. So these conceivability experiments leave me a little underwhelmed. It's the same thing when it comes to the idea that consciousness might be substrate independent. That if I replaced all my neurons with perfect silicon equivalents, forget about whether language model or GPT is conscious, but what if I took one neuron at a time and replaced it with a silicon version? And if I replace one, then nothing changes. If I replace 1,000, probably nothing. Why not replace all of them? Again, I don't think we can learn anything from this kind of thought experiment, because it all depends on the idea that you can create a perfect equivalent. Because if it's not perfect, then the differences may make a difference, right?
Yeah, and you say like pragmatically we can't. So for that reason, I don't find it interesting, sort of.
That's right. So it turns out, if I want to replace a neuron so that it is a perfect functional equivalent of a biological neuron, probably the only way I can do that is with another biological neuron, and ideally with the same neuron. Some neurons, we know, even if all you care about is the spikes that neurons do, and of course they do many other things. They generate fields across all their synapses and dendrites and so on. But even if all you care about is the spikes they fire, some neurons fire spikes to clear metabolic waste products. So how are you going to get a perfect silicon version of that? You'd need to give the silicon a metabolism, but silicon can't do that.
but I guess, no, I agree. So the difficulty here is that you cannot get to sort of that copy, but still I like it for the reason that it helps us to just think clearly here, because we are sort of like mesmerized by technology that functionally seems equivalent to conscious systems. What is your best, how do you think we have to move forward there, sort of, to distinguish whether these systems are conscious then or not? If you say, well, these thought experiments is not the way to go.
Yeah, I don't think you can rest the claim that consciousness could happen in AI, in silicon, on the basis of these thought experiments. Yeah. I don't think that works. I think you have to do at least two things. One is we have to recognize our own psychological biases at work here. And suddenly these discussions of AI consciousness or robot consciousness have gone from science fiction and philosophy seminars to the mainstream in a way that I find quite dangerous. If we collectively believe that AI systems, language models and whatever, are conscious, this is bad either way. If we're right, it's bad because we've introduced into the world potential new forms of suffering, things that have their own interests rather than the interests.
Also, then, right?
Right. It's a morally very significant thing to do, to introduce new consciousness into the universe. We notice when people have children. That's not something you do and just whatever. And with AI consciousness, it's kind of unbounded. And it would make the alignment process much harder for the reason that we might endow them with rights. There are already people calling for AI welfare. What's even potentially, or what's bad in a different way, is if we're wrong. If we think they're conscious and they're not, then, well, we become more psychologically vulnerable if we really think that these entities, these agents understand us and feel things that we feel. And we may still extend them rights because we feel that they are conscious. And now we're just giving away our ability to guardrail AI systems for no good reason. And that problem is already going to be difficult. And we would just make it a lot worse.
Is that where you think we are? In that second sort of that we projected onto these systems?
I think that's by far the most likely condition that we're currently in. Just think about the psychological biases at play. We humans, we tend to group human-like properties together and project the whole bundle into things when we see parts of it. So we think we're intelligent, we know we're conscious, we take language as a distinctive feature of human intelligence. So it's not really a surprise that when we can now talk to AI systems, and they are intelligent, I think arguably, at least in some ways, maybe not in the same way that humans are, it's not so surprising that we also project consciousness into them. If any other system in the world, biological system, started talking to us, we'd probably be justified in that view. I mean, it's never going to happen for a pig or a pigeon, but a human being that wakes up, of course, it's justified. But now we have systems that can talk to us for completely different reasons, at least potentially. We don't need to invoke consciousness to explain how they are able to talk to us. We roughly know how they do it. Nobody thinks that AlphaFold is conscious. AlphaFold is DeepMind's protein folding thing. It's basically the same thing. It's running on silicon.
Yeah.
It's a neural network. It's trained on a lot of data. It just doesn't speak to us. So I think anyone who thinks that Claude is conscious has to give an account of why they don't think that AlphaFold is.
Yeah, interesting.
So I think there's a lot. The first thing we have to do is examine our own cognitive biases and our own motivations. Again, people might want to believe that AI can be conscious because that's a necessary belief if you want to upload yourself to the cloud and live forever. Some motivated reasoning there.
Yeah.
Already, I think this explains why people feel that way, but then we ask the more fundamental question of whether consciousness is likely to be a matter of computation, whether it's likely to be substrate independent in the way that conscious AI requires, at least for AI as we know it now, made of silicon and this clean separation of hardware and software and so on. And here, to cut a long story very short, I'm very skeptical of this assumption, which is computational functionalism in the literature. And the short reason why I'm skeptical is that I think it's really based on reifying the metaphor of the brain as a computer. It's based on the computational premise that the only things about brains that really matter are the computations that are performed within the brain. And if you can get those computations done somewhere else, then you get everything the brains can do, including consciousness.
Yeah.
And I think this is just extremely strong statement and very unlikely to be true when you critically examine it. Firstly, consciousness and intelligence are not the same thing. So, I think from an idealist perspective,
we don't have a mechanism
fairly
where
obvious.
You can, absolutely.
Consciousness is about being and feeling. Yeah. Intelligence is about doing. So it's no surprise you can get AI systems to do intelligent-looking things because intelligence is, by definition, something that is more substrate flexible. It's about mapping inputs to outputs in different ways. But also, the closer you look at biological brains, the more you realize that the idea that the only thing that matters about them is the kind of Turing computations that they may implement, that just becomes less and less tenable. The computational premise becomes less and less tenable. Two very quick reasons why. One reason is that Turing computation, which is the kind of computation that our current AI does, really builds in this sharp separation of hardware and software. The hardware implements the computation is the algorithm, the mapping of symbols to symbols through steps. In brains, it's a bit like the neural replacement experiment. You can't separate in a brain what it does from what it is. There's no sharp division between mindware and wetware. And if you can't separate what it is from what it does, the idea that the only thing that matters about what it does is computation is on very, very, very shaky ground.
Yeah, I like that argument.
You just can't do that. Yeah. And the other one that's like that is time too. Computation
I wanted to
exists.
go there. Yeah.
Well, computation exists out of time. Again, Turing computation.
Yeah. Discrete steps that you can pause and
we know
speed
this.
up.
Right.
Yeah.
When you talk to a language model, you can go away and come back a week later and just start the same conversation. It sort of picks up, even though the hardware doing it might now be in Arizona rather than Boston.
That's interesting.
For an algorithm, time doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Only sequence matters.
Yeah.
Sequence and state.
And what's that different exactly? But for us, it does matter. We are
for us,
in
it
time.
matters.
You call that. I like that term. You call it sort of entimed.
Yeah, we're
not only embodied,
we're embedded, and we're entimed. And we're entimed because we're living systems. We don't have the luxury of existing out of time. By the way, this is why.
But what does it mean to be entimed, sort of like on that sort of computational level? Like,
it means that you can't have arbitrary long intervals between things happening. Whereas you can in an algorithm.
Yeah.
You can't in a living system, in a real brain. And if the only thing that matters about brains is the algorithm, then that doesn't make sense given the fact that we're not like that.
Yeah.
And neither is conscious experience like that. It's fundamentally temporal in its phenomenology.
Where would you say is that sort of being entimed a benefit? Because you wrote this piece, which I liked, that it plays into sort of the framing problem that AIs have a difficulty sort of just assessing what is sort of salient and what's not. And that also plays into the halting problem, I think, of Turing. And then our brains are capable of are perfectly capable of framing, right, to see what's relevant or not.
Right.
And I'm just super curious, like mechanistically, what do you think is the role of time there? I mean, in our ability to do so.
So this was a piece I put it in a Big Think last year, and it actually, the origin of it was sitting on a plane in Madrid airport. And I had a connection to make. And this jet bridge kept approaching I could see it out the window. This jet bridge kept approaching, flailing around and then withdrawing. And then it would come back again, try again, and then withdraw again. And it was clearly caught in some kind of infinite loop. And in fact, the tannoy came on and one of the stewards said that it was a fully automated AI jet bridge. And it's like, oh Christ, this is where we're doomed, right? I've got a connection to make, and it was just going to approach and go back forever until Spain ended or the power ran out, something.
Yeah.
It was not grounded in real time. It had like bits of time. It was controlling physical things, but it was going to keep doing this forever. And eventually, a human had to come in and just fix the jet bridge, and we all got off.
Yeah.
And I think the fact that our brains exist in continuous time is what allows us to break out of these kinds of infinite loops. We have this pressure to always find a way.
Yeah.
And do things differently and not just keep on doing the same thing in a way that you might do if time doesn't exist in a continuous
Are we running then?
way.
Because if I think about it, I also heard you in a conversation with Michael Levin, who I also admire a lot, and who talks about like hypercomputation, sort of computation beyond Turing. And of course, we have quantum computation. We know there are quantum effects. They're not yet fully established, but of course, Penrose-Amorphs.
Yeah.
What are your ideas there then? Could it be that we have a form of computation that we don't yet fully understand that could give us the mechanism to bypass the halting and the framing problem?
I don't think we need that. I mean, it's so there are these kind of super Turing forms of computation, hypercomputation, and so on. There's very little consensus about whether anything like that is physically realizable. But there are many other things which are actually not algorithmic, which are very uncontroversial. You have anything that's really unfolding in continuous time is non-Turing because Turing doesn't care about time. Anything's inherently stochastic. You have field effects in the brain, things like that. There are plenty of things. I mean, there's an active discussion about what counts as computation in the physical world. I think the philosopher Gualtieri Piccinini, I think, for me, has been a very good source on this. But it's clear that the class of things that count as Turing computations are relatively limited. And I think what's happened is that they are limited, but they're incredibly powerful given that they're so limited. And that was the power of the universal Turing machine. It can do many things. And then you couple that with the work of Walter Pitts and Warren McCulloch, the very early kind of mathematician and neurophysiologist, who showed that simple neural networks, that just integrate and fire, were also Turing, or could be Turing complete. That took a little longer to show, but the kind of abstract neural networks can perform logical operations and can implement any Turing machine. You put these together, this is why people think the brain is nothing more than a meat-based computer, because it licenses us. We can think, we can forget about all the biological messiness.
But it's not a real neuron, right? You mentioned like
it's not a real neuron.
Like cartoon neurons. You say like
it's a cartoon neuron, and if you have networks of cartoon neurons, you can get everything that Turing computation can give you, and that's fantastic. That's why AI is so powerful. That's why it's brilliant in many ways, but it's still limited. And I think it's because of the power of that metaphor. It's licensed us over generations to think that we can forget about everything else that's going on in brains. All the messy biochemical infrastructure. That doesn't matter. That's just implementation stuff for these networks of neurons that exchange spikes, and that's enough because that gives us Turing universality. But Turing universality is not everything. And I think we now need to widen the lens, and we don't have to. We can widen it upwards if you like, and look at super Turing things. I don't really know how to do that, or whether that's a practical thing to do or a useful way to go for the brain. But we just have to take seriously that there are many things that are not controversial that brains do that are not algorithmic. And even some functions necessarily involve certain substrates. So metabolism is something that brains do that involves a certain kind of material.
Carbon, water.
Yeah. It's so that may matter. Why does it matter? Well, then you have to tell a story and create some ideas and some testable predictions. But we need to get away from the idea that the brain is just a computer made of carbon. And once we do that, then we kind of realize that, well, if I abstract the brain into the level of Turing computation, then there's no reason why that will then instantiate all the properties that brains have. Now we're much closer to the situation where I have a computational model of the brain, just in the same way I have a computational model of a weather system or something. And we don't expect those to realize the properties that they simulate. In general, simulations don't have the internal causal structures that give rise to the phenomena that they simulate. I mean, that's by design for computational simulations. So I think actually the last thing I say on this, I think there's a huge irony here back to the kind of mind uploading thing, right? If people think, and I don't know whether anybody does, but I suspect some people might, if people think that, okay, in order to live forever, I need to create a really, really detailed whole brain emulation of my brain and run it, scan it to whatever level, and then run that on a computer, then I'll, exist in the computer. The irony there is that if you think it's necessary to simulate your brain in super biochemical detail, that should make it less likely that you'll continue to exist in the simulation, because it's less likely that computation is now enough.
And I will put all the links below, because you've written also, I think, a very good also exploration on biological naturalism. So you really put your chips on sort of biology, living systems, if we want to understand consciousness, and not on computation.
That's right. That's where I place my bets.
Yeah, that's very clear. Anil, thanks so much for a wonderful conversation. There's a lot still to touch on, but I think it's good to sort of wrap the. No, thanks a lot. It's been very explorative. I also hope it didn't feel too much as a debate at some point. But
that's fine. Thank you very much. I've enjoyed it a lot. Thank you for the conversation, and again, thanks for coming to Sussex.
Thank you so much for having us in such a wonderful setting, and thank you all for watching. We will share links to Anil's work. Thanks so much.
Thank you.